Sorry, I didn't have my mic on. Okay, let's go back again. This is a good thing that you can do is you can go back again. So this is a week where we are pinpointing the purpose of Lighthouse Gap University. The reason behind it is to find God's calling, His appointment for your life. Actually, we think of that as being your diploma. Finding out what God is or God has determined for your life. His story is history. My story is my history. And we want our stories to be in concert with what God created us to be. John 15:16 says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit." You might be fruitful. Fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. There's a principle there that the calling of your life is the one that God really blesses your life. What a statement he made. Have you determined what God chose you to do with your life? He appointed you. I think of it as you have a particular question. What do you see that's missing? What you see that's missing, maybe in the church and in the world, maybe that's what God has appointed you to fill the gap. Also in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you received." And so we have the first testimony. We're going to have testimonies all week long about people that have found the calling of Jesus Christ for their lives. And these are great, great people. And their calling is a great calling because it's the calling that God has put on their lives. And so we're going to start off with Zach Scribner, and he's going to come. He's going to share with us God's calling and appointment.
Amen. Good morning. So there's a long backstory. Growing up in the church, there's a lot that, if you will, you could say I grew up always in God, but not always having God dwelling inside me and guiding me. And specifically for this series, not always following God's calling. And so just to start at the beginning, growing up, one of 8 children, from the years of 5, when I was 5 years old till I was 20, we lived at a house, we would call it the Georgina house. But I mean, this was the majority of my life before I was married and, before I really answered the call of God. But at Georgina, there's so many fond memories that I have there. The house was very large, and there was never a dull moment in that house. Many people from the church lived with us together. As a boy, I remember waking up. I must have been only about 6 years old, but I remember waking up and getting dressed in my Dodgers outfit or whatever baseball team I wanted to wear that day, that I had. I would get all dressed up, and I'd run to the basement, and I'd wake this guy up, and I'd ask him, it was probably 6 a.m., and ask him to come and play baseball with me in the backyard. And, the backyard was huge for me as a 5 or 6 year old. But, as we got older, we grew out of that, and we had to go and, use other people's yards in the neighborhood. But I remember that this gentleman, Rick Grogan, lived with us. But we had a lot of people that lived with us. And, as I got older, there were more men that lived in the house that kind of, I don't want to say served a role, but that they had a great and tremendous influence in my life. Two men, Chris and George Neos, they moved in. I was still pretty young living in the house, but I remember they would teach us how to, play card games, coming from the East Coast. They would teach us how, I probably learned how to play blackjack and all these other card games. I remember, our favorite was this one called Kings in the Corner. And I still remember the games, and I still, teach kids how to play them, and, learned a lot of, we had a lot of really good times. But, when Chris moved in with us, his brother on the East Coast heard, he's living in this house with, 20-something people, and his brother comes out to check on him, worried that maybe he's involved in a cult or something. And it wasn't long after that his brother George then moved out and moved into our house. And so Chris eventually got married, went and pastored a church. He's one of our pastors he's the pastor up in Port Hueneme. And George would marry my sister Beth. But these men in my life had a tremendous impact. I remember Chris was my Little League baseball coach. And, me and another boy were driving to the field, and we're going down this hill, and I'll never forget, we stop at the bottom of the hill at the stop sign, and Chris just says, oh no, or, hold on. And we just get rammed, in the back. It was probably the first accident that I was in. Many more would come once I got my license. But I think that, spending this time with Chris, he was developing me, he was instilling things in me. And, George would later become my high school football coach. These were people that lived in my house, and I had a very close relationship with them. Another man, Mike Lynch, when I was in junior high, he was a business. He did finance for a bank. And I remember in the summer, we would go to Lincoln Middle School, and, he'd finish all of his work in the morning, maybe by noon or so. And he would take me out and teach me how to play basketball. And so there was just so many of these stories I could continue and go on and on about men who lived in our home that started instilling in me, in, if you will, preaching the word to me on a daily basis. And so I had such a rich development in learning about God. And I was always having fun with these men. Mike eventually gave up that job where he was making a considerable amount of money to teach at the high school, where I would be in junior high, and he was my junior high teacher. As a freshman in high school, I worked for a man who was in the church. His name was Mike Fort, and he did coin grading. And so he was teaching me how to evaluate coins, and we would, grade them. People would send the coin in, and you examine it, and you determine, what grade this coin has, and you'd send it back, right? Mike Fort had married a woman named Christy Lewis who lived in our house. And so Christy Lewis had, growing up, she had been my high school teacher at one point, but one of the big things in our house was this 6 a.m. morning prayer. And so, all these men, looking back, you could say, all right, so you had all these different men influencing your life, and what about your father? And so you could think, as having 7 brothers and sisters, that it could be hard to find alone time or one-on-one time with your dad. But believe it or not, there was one place that I always knew if I wanted to have alone time with my dad, I knew where I could get it. And that was if I got up and I went to 6 a.m. prayer. So if I was willing to get up, my dad would take me. We'd go to Starbucks. I would probably get like a maple scone. Unfortunately, they don't have those anymore. But those were the best. And so it was like this treat. I could get up early. I could have some alone time with my dad, get a maple scone, and then go to the church for 6 a.m. prayer. And this was one of the things in the house, is that these people, they were encouraged, urged, forced, however you want to put it, to come to morning prayer, at least once a week, I believe is what it was. But the ones who went to morning prayer on a regular basis, these ones made it. And what I mean by made it is their faith lasted. Many of them would go on and preach. And, I can look back and I can say, I knew that there was that time that I could have with my dad. And so whenever, if any thought came to my mind regarding my dad, Pastor Rob, it was always in relation to, there was football, there was church, right? There was morning prayer. But the most consistent thing was that 6 a.m. morning prayer. So I'm in high school at this point, and a man, helps out a friend of mine, gives him a job here cleaning at the church, Peter Caesar. He hires one of my good friends, Justin Kane. And so Justin says, hey, do you want to come and clean on Saturdays with us? Yeah, sure, why not? So we're cleaning on Saturdays. We're having a great time. We enjoy it. And we go on Sunday mornings to this Bible study with Pastor Peter Caesar. And Peter began to instill in us so many different things. We would read a book about all the different names of God. Even to this day, when I pray and I'm asking for healing, I call upon Jehovah Rapha, God our healer, right? And there's Jehovah Nissi, God our banner. And this is in me from that book. And, I don't know that I've read the book again, but I'll never throw the book out. It sits there on my shelf. I'll look at it. And I remember that time. It was such a rich time learning from Pastor Peter. And having all of these different men influencing my life has truly made me, and developed me in so many ways that I couldn't have obtained in really any other way. Because I lived with these men. They lived in my home. And, as a high schooler, I'm 17 at this point, and the church was in some financial struggles. So they were, trying to cut some expenses, and their maintenance, the head of maintenance was probably 2 or 3 times what it would cost to pay a 17-year-old boy to clean the church. So the church was paying me $10 an hour, but as a 17-year-old with 25 plus hours a week, I felt like the most blessed, the richest person in the world. And so I would go to school and I would tell my friends, my friends would attest to this, that I'd say, it's on the house, right? That was my term. And so what that meant was I was going to buy everybody lunch, okay? And this would happen, usually on Wednesdays, because McDonald's had $1 Big Macs on Wednesdays, and we'd go and just buy a ton of Big Macs. But I just remember feeling so blessed, so wealthy, because of this job cleaning at the church, making $10 an hour, and I felt as though I was in debt to the church at that point. There were so many good things in my life because of the church, and I have to say that taking that job at 17, and technically still to this day, still working that job, is been, I can't say it's the greatest blessing of my life, right? Because Jesus is that, but it's something that is connected and tied me to Jesus. And so I can see that as a link. And if I look back on my life, I can say God was doing so many different things in my life. And some things that I didn't like, some things that I loved, but everything that he was doing, he was directing my steps. And the Bible says in Proverbs 19:21, sorry, I'm just getting organized. The Bible says in 19:21, oh, maybe I don't have it here. 19:21, it says, many plans that a man has, right? Basically, a man makes many plans, but the Lord directs his steps. And so all the plans that I had, right, my plans, through them, God was directing my steps. And I just want to encourage you this morning that as you're making plans, if they are your plans, you have to be aware that if you're connected to God, that he's going to redirect you. And so, growing up, never knowing who of my friends are going to stick around, there was one in particular that is, been, in the Bible, there's David. David had a best friend, Jonathan, right? And so there were times when David was in trouble and Jonathan risked his life to save David's life. There were, and these two were, if you will, inseparable. And for me, that friend has been Justin Kane. Justin Kane grew up, he's a grade behind me, but he's been a large part of my growth as a Christian. Without him, I don't know exactly, where I would be as a Christian, how I would be, because it's very difficult as a young man in high school, growing up without any other Christian friends. And I can see people that have grown up and everybody around them has been a negative influence, or in high school they get to that point and they don't have that friend that holds them to the truth. In Proverbs 27:17 it says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And this was Justin for me. He was that iron that was sharpening me. Somebody that I could go to and I could confess my sins to, and we could work through it. That we always had each other's best interests in mind. And having grown up in the church together, we both were in it together. So through all of this, all these experiences, I developed this habit of coming to 6 a.m. prayer. And, there's so many great stories I could tell you about 6 a.m. prayer, but probably the most notable is I wake up early one morning, I get in the car, and I don't have my music for some reason. I got the heater on, blasting the heater. It's nice and warm and cozy. And I always blast my music to keep me awake on the way, the 5-minute drive from home to the church. So I'm coming down 20th Street, and I'll never forget, I get to the stop sign and I stop, and I'm just like feeling so cozy. And I wake up, meaning I fell asleep. I wake up to a huge bang, and that is I hit the car parked on the side of the road. Boom, and I bounce back, and I'm in the middle, I'm in the aisle, the road, and it's just one way each side, and I'm like 2 or 3 blocks from the church, so I drive to the church, don't stop. And I park at the church, and I'm like, what just happened? Did I just hit a car? And I'm like, I don't know. So I get out of the car, and I'm just shaking up. And I look at the cream puff, which is our old, I don't know what year it was, Mercedes, and just the whole front side is just smashed. Black, and I'm just like, oh my gosh. So I walk in, trying to figure out what I'm going to do. I walk in, my dad's sitting where he always does, right inside the sanctuary, and I say, Dad, I hit a car. What are you talking about? I fell asleep and I hit a car. Well, did you leave a note? No. He's like, well, you got to leave a note. So, of course, I'm not going to drive back up there. I just walk back up, thinking, and I leave a note on the car. And, this is just, I think that was my first accident. There was a few more to come. But, there was a lot to learn, but it's a memory that I have coming to prayer. Coming to 6 a.m. prayer. And so wherever you are listening to this, I just want to encourage you. You might not have the ability to come to the church at 6 a.m. right now. You may not have the ability, even when this pandemic is over, you may not have the opportunity to come to 6 a.m. prayer. But if you want God's plan in your life to come to fruition, if you want to see the blessing of God in your life, you have to have a morning devotion. You have to have that time where you're showing God that you care about what his plans are, that you're really going to put in the time and the effort, the energy to get a hold of him. And, when I'm cleaning in the mornings, to this day, when I wake up to clean the church, I'm always listening to the Bible or listening to, a sermon I'm praying and talking to God, and I'm having this special devotion time. And I just remember throughout the years, there would be times that people would come alongside me and they'd want to help and clean in the morning together with me. And it was like I would get afraid or fearful that somehow I was going to lose that time with God. And I would experience it. Somebody would come and they would work with me for, 6 months or something like this. And my relationship with God would start to wade. I would start to drift because I wasn't having that time. And yes, of course, I could have had other time. I could have set apart other time. But there's something special about waking up and the first thing that you do, having time with God. So, moving on in my life, I wanted to get married young, growing up in the church, and I wanted to preach the gospel. I remember in high school, we snuck into this school, Roosevelt Elementary School. It's something we would do almost on a weekly basis. At night, we'd sneak into this elementary school, me and all my church buddies, to play hide and go seek. And so we had this large group. There was probably about 10, 12 of us. And we're playing hide and go seeks, climbing on the buildings and all this kind of stuff. After we're sitting at the benches, the lunch tables at Roosevelt, and we're just talking. And I remember my wife now, but just a friend at the time, Hillary, we're sitting there and she's talking about how she's going to marry rich and all this, and she's going to travel the world. And leaving there, talking to my buddies, I'm like, gosh, I'm never marrying somebody like that. And the truth is I didn't, but I did marry her. Thank God she changed. No, I'm just kidding. But, a few years later, I was talking to this other girl, praying and asking God, if this was something I should be pursuing. And I'm at Tucson Bible Conference. I'm driving back, and one of my football coaches, Ben Jenkins, tells me, you can't be with this girl. It's not a good workout. It's long distance, all this kind of thing. And, believe it or not, shortly after that, Hillary approaches me kind of saying like, hey, do you think your brother Nate would be interested in me? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe, so we started talking on the phone at night, and I'm trying to give her pointers and insight as to what Nate's interested in and this and that. And, after a little bit of this, I'm thinking, you know what? I think I want this girl, right? And so we, eventually we began courting, and of course we got married. Now we have 3 children, Amelia, Phoebe, and we've got one on the way. The blood test says that it's a boy, so praise the Lord on that. But we moved into a house after we were married. We moved into this house. It's a larger house. And we had this opportunity to kind of do what my parents had done at Georgina. And we had people move into our house. And originally, in the beginning, there was a lot of international students that moved in with us. We had some Chinese people, some people from Japan, from Switzerland, all over the world. And, Argentina, all these different people. And our children grew up, with all of these different influences, all these different cultures. And it was such a beautiful thing. Eventually, we got to what I had originally wanted to do in the house was have some people from the church moving in. And so my best friend, Justin Kane, he moved in. A man, Lucas Morida, moved in, ended up getting married, moving out, still in the church, teaches at our junior high. Felipe Rodriguez. And in this house, my children, getting to know these men and, women who lived with us, Cece and Tammy, who are still in our church, it's like we developed a family inside our home. And it's just such a special and a beautiful thing. When people in the church are living together, you see each other on a daily basis. You have to grow because otherwise there's conflict. And I feel like there's conflict every day in a house like that. And so I think that there was something special at Georgina that developed in me certain qualities that made me dependent on God. And in this house this opportunity that we had in Wellesley, unfortunately, we weren't able to keep the house. But, there were such special things that happened in my daughter, Amelia. She has a very close relationship with, Cece and Tammy, who lived with us. They're like her older sisters. And I believe that this is part of what God's plan is for us in the church to be together, to be living together always, on a daily basis, as much as we possibly can. And although our society here in Los Angeles makes that very difficult, of course, right now with this pandemic, impossible. But, there was something in that house at Georgina where I had all of these different men inserting in there was other men who would, talk to me about the Bible, and I would go and I'd talk to my dad. Oh, I learned all this cool stuff. What? What was he telling you? No. That's off, right? But for the most part, they're instilling these qualities, these characters of God in my life that tremendously helped guide my plan. And just lastly, I want to talk about my plans in life. My personal plan in life was to grow up, to play football in the NFL like my father did. And, if I were, as I developed in Christ, I began to learn that I had what I would call an Isaac, which is something that could become an idol or could become more important than God in your life. And trying to identify my Isaac, it wasn't very long before I realized my Isaac was my father. I wanted to be just like him. I wanted to play professional football. I wanted to be a pastor. I wanted these things because of my father. And so there was a point in my life when I had to give that up and give up what I thought was, God's plan for my life. And I wanted God's plan for my life to be a professional football player. I went to SMC. I didn't even have to work to the top to there. All the players ahead of me just quit or got cut or, blew it. And God just put me in a spot where I was the starting quarterback at Santa Monica College. And, my second year, I was the starter. I was going to be playing the whole year. There were some disappointments, but I had a great time, and I made a lot of new friends, particularly a man named Anthony Wyndham. Ended up being in my wedding. We had a great friendship, and still to this day are friends. And God was just directing my path. In spring 2010, I was in the best shape of my life. I mean, I truly believe, I believed at the time that I could walk on into UCLA and I could work my way to be the quarterback. After that, I got married January 2011. So spring 2010, I'm transferring to UCLA. I take the semester off. I get married in January 2011. And you can say goodbye to my football career. No, I'm just kidding. No. So my dad helped me get a tryout on the team. So I try out for the UCLA football team, and I make the team. And so now I'm living my dream. I'm playing football at UCLA just like my dad. All I have to do is get that starting spot, work my way up, and I can play football in the NFL. But God's plans came. And the number one recruit in the nation, I believe he was number one, Brett Hundley, he's a quarterback, comes to UCLA about 4 or 5 months after I joined the team. And so seeing him come, basically I had the decision that I wasn't going to be playing quarterback because they were going to put all their effort into this new young recruit. So I had to make a decision. Did I want to keep playing football and change positions, or did I want to let it go? And it was actually a very easy decision because God had been preparing my heart. When I went to UCLA, it was like a different experience. It was like a job. I wasn't enjoying it quite like I had enjoyed it at Santa Monica College. And so it was easy for me to walk away. But also what made it easy for me to walk away was the fact that as I was cleaning, as I had been in prayer in the morning, in that morning time, there was something about God just kind of directing my paths. It was just like, oh, this is the open door. This is where God is directing me. It's clear. And so when you have that morning time of prayer, there's a clarity in your life when you're taking a step. Now, this isn't to say that every step is going to be like, everything is dark and there's just like a illuminated pathway, like in the airplane. There's like little lights along the path and you just follow the path. It's not always going to be like that. But there's something about when you're in contact with God that he illuminates the truth. He illuminates the path for you. In this proverb, Solomon's saying that he directs our path. Although we make plans, and we should make plans, although we prepare, he's directing our paths. And so I really believe that God directed my path out of UCLA, and I began teaching at the high school, where I'm teaching to this day. So I'm cleaning. Today we're living in the back house of my wife's parents. It's a wonderful blessing, Mike and Allison Hagoski, who Mike, I believe, is our oldest, longest member of our church. And working at the high school, working with young men, like I said, I began cleaning the church at 17 years old, which is 14 years ago. Still working, cleaning the church to this day. Probably one of the greatest blessings in my life, aside from my wife, Jesus, and my family. But also, there was a sense that when I was working here at the church, I had this feeling of, how do I put this? That I didn't deserve how good I had it. Cleaning at the church, I could get up at 4:30 in the morning. I could clean by 7:30. I could be done with my job, having put in my 3 hours, and I could go to school at Santa Monica College. Getting up at 4:30, I could clean, and then I could go teach. Right? If I wanted to sleep in, I could clean in the evenings, late at night. And one of the ways that I knew that Hillary was right for me is when I was so busy, we didn't have any time to spend together when we were courting. She would come and she would clean the church with me at night. And that's what we would do. And that's when we would hang out. And so this cleaning, sacrificing, some people would say it was a sacrifice, but for me it was a blessing. And there's many people that I was able to work with along the way. Joseph Kane, great times playing, wrestling here on the altar, while we're cleaning the church. Tex, my brother-in-law, Garrett, Levi, Hosea. We're having airsoft wars here in the sanctuary, stacking the chairs, making bunkers, and all this kind of stuff. I remember when the kids were younger, some of the younger guys, we're having an airsoft war in the sanctuary, and the airsoft war is over, and so we're going to have to start cleaning up. But some of the older guys are standing here on the stage, and they're shooting at the younger guys. And I'm like, you know what? I'm telling the young guys, I'm going to be on your team. I'm with you guys. And so while they're all shooting, I go out in the back prayer room, and I put on like snow gear so that I'm invulnerable. They can't penetrate my armor. And I get out a stronger airsoft gun that we wouldn't normally use. And I just come from behind the young guys and just start shooting them in the back, right? And so this was kind of like their training, to toughen them up. But the kids, they just loved it. And, even to this day, I'll have kids that will hear stories and they'll say, how come you don't do that anymore? How come you stopped doing that? And I think that this is something that happens to us as we get older. We stop doing those things. We stop having that influence. We stop spending that time with the younger kids. We stop implementing and instilling in their lives because life gets us busy. I forgot who said it, but I believe it was maybe it was Corey Ten Boom, but whoever said it, if the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. And so I think that this is one of the greatest attacks against God's plan in our life. God will direct your path, but if you're too busy, If you're too busy for God, you'll be distracted. And I think that we can use this time in our country, this time in our church, where we're forced to be at home. We're forced to not be busy, to think about ways that we can be instilling in the younger generations, that we can be spending time influencing them, implementing and inputting what God has spoken in our lives, how God has directed our lives to help them. From the beginning, God's plan has always been using men and women to influence the world, to impact the world. And we as people, as God's people, we have to be constantly finding ways and asking God for ways that he can use us to influence people. And I believe that my plan was for me. I wanted glory. And God's plan is not that we would just give and bring him glory, but it's that as we humble ourselves, he will lift us up. And everything that I've done for God in my life, I've never regretted. He's always directed my path. Everything that I've done for myself seems to have always failed, and actually left me not as happy as I thought it would leave me. And as we continue in life, as we continue to grow, as we continue to think about our plans, I want you to consider, have you brought your plans to God?